Before we get to the episode, we want you, dear listener, to ask yourself a question. What have you done these past 2 years? You know, the pandemic hit us all really hard. What have you really done other than perfect that matzo ball soup recipe of yours? Nothing. Now, we all want to add purpose and meaning to our life, and we have the way to really, really make your dreams come true. If you're listening, you're likely interested in Israel with hopes of traveling here soon. Well, lucky for you, we've got the scoop on Massa Israel journey. With an amazing range of life-changing opportunities in Israel, Massa has many, many programs. They've got gap year programs, academics, internships, volunteering, and careers. The pandemic didn't stop them either, promoting options to study remotely while living in Israel. You don't have to be fluent in Hebrew or break your bank account. They even supply partial funding so you can make a positive impact on the world. You can fuel your passion and you can make your travel dreams a reality. Go to massaisrael.org and find out more. In February 2022, U.S. inflation rose to a 40-year peak, a staggering 7.9%, which means that every month your dollar can buy less and less and less. This, combined with the rising prices of both energy and other commercial goods, may lead to an economic disaster, possibly more severe than anyone can imagine. The markets haven't been doing well either, and in the past several months, it seems most of the pandemic time's earnings and high company valuations were literally scrapped. So why is this happening? Who's to blame? And can something still be done, or is it too late? To answer these mind-boggling questions and much more, we have with us today no other than David Wu. David Wu is a former Bank of America strategist, now CEO of David Wu Unbound, a global forum devoted to the promotion of fact-based debates about markets, politics, and economics. In 2013, David was voted as one of the 12 smartest people on Wall Street by Business Insider magazine. We are super, super thrilled to have him on the show today to talk about the economic problems we're all facing and how we might better prepare for what's to come. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So where do we start? I mean, are we doomed or is there hope?
I think the situation is pretty bad at the moment, but I don't think, and I think inflation is just one aspect of it. I mean, I think first of all, just to talk a little bit about inflation, I think, something that, you guys probably look like you're in your 30s. You can't really relate to, to some extent, I can't relate to this either, but people are worried now about stagflation. Stagflation is something that we haven't seen since the 1970s. Okay. Now, what is stagflation and what are we talking about here? But first of all, let me just tell you this. The last 30 years have been a period of incredible prosperity around the world. We saw rising productivity. We saw rising standard of living. We saw inflation coming down globally. We saw about 1 billion people being pulled out of extreme poverty around the world. So the last 30 years couldn't have been any better. In fact, if you take any random 30 years in world history, the last 2,000 years, I don't think you could find easily another 30 years where so many people partook in this increased prosperity around the world. Now, you say, well, why is that? What happened in the last 30 years that we had this amazing prosperity? I think there were 3 major factors. One was, of course, the IT revolution that really got the whole thing started in terms of raising productivity. I mean, think about it. It used to be the case, like, everybody had a secretary, okay, on Wall Street. By the time I left Wall Street last year, I think I shared a secretary with 20 other people, right? Because instead you have Outlook, you have Word, you have Excel. I mean, so from that point of view, you can see what the efficiency gain was just from a very, very simple example like that. The second most important factor contributing to the prosperity of the last 30 years, of course, was the end of Cold War I, right? In 1991, that was the former Soviet Union basically dissolved. Berlin Wall came down. And that was an amazing, basically, development because, for one thing, it created massive peace dividends. So all the money that governments until then were channeling towards building arms, defense, and so on and so forth, guess what? That money started to go somewhere else into investing, education, healthcare, you name it. So that was another major thing, right? Mm-hmm. The integration of the former Soviet Union countries into the world economy, Poland, Hungary. That was a great story. Mm-hmm. The third most important factor, okay, in the last 30 years, contributing to general prosperity, of course, was the entry of China into the World Trade Organization 10 years later, okay, in 2000, right? That sort of culminated with the whole notion of globalization, that things basically became outsourced in China, the Chinese started to basically grow, the whole basically. So that was economic dividend. These three things contributed to this massive prosperity. And guess what? What's happening right now, okay, I'm talking about, of course, the war in Ukraine, is putting two of these three factors into total jeopardy.
And the third is also in, I don't know, a bit dubious nowadays.
You're talking about the tech revolution?
No, about the China.
Oh, no, that's what I mean. I'm talking about the second
those
and
are
third.
The two. Okay.
Right? Because what I think a lot of people don't understand, I think whether it's in Israel or the U.S., for that matter, what people don't realize is that we know actually very little about this war. Because honestly, I've been saying this for the last 6 weeks, that alongside the kinetic war, where people are firing shots at each other, a far more important, powerful war being fought is over basically the war of disinformation. You know, the information warfare during this war so far, waged by both sides, has been absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah,
you know,
they're both pretty good.
They're both pretty good, and I don't believe a word basically either side is saying. Okay, but the bottom line here is this: there is no question that this has been. But to me, there's no question that this war, really, if you think about it, is not about Russia and Ukraine. To me, this is a proxy war between U.S. and China. That is something people don't realize.
You think Russia is now a proxy of China?
Listen, let me tell you this.
They met, Xi and Putin met a few weeks before the war started, famously.
Listen.
And no one knows.
Let me tell you a little bit about this. There's a whole background in this. And this is why I'm not creating conspiracy theories. I mean, all these things I'm going to tell you, you can back up in facts. You can even look it up in fake news media like the New York Times, okay? Now, let me tell you this, right? For the last 5 years, okay, there's no doubt the U.S. has become ever more wary about the rise in China. I can tell you, a couple of years ago, I was invited, by the Defense Department to go down to Washington, go into the Pentagon to talk to them about the U.S.-China relationship. And I can tell you, they're very concerned about the rise of China because they're wary that China could challenge the American hegemony. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, and this is why they went out of their way to kill Huawei, for example. I mean, if you remember, Huawei was this great Chinese company. The Chinese spent 20 years building up this company, and it took the U.S. 2 years to completely destroy it. I mean, so that it would never challenge the American dominance in basically information technology. Now, what's interesting is this. A year ago, China and Russia signed a strategic partnership.
Yeah.
Now, let me tell you this. That made...
Also China and Iran, by the way.
Well, China and Iran afterwards. That was afterwards. Okay. But China and basically Russia first signed a strategic partnership, which made basically Washington very, very nervous. You can imagine, right? Because you're talking about two countries, for very different reasons are very good at what they did. If they were to get into bed together, this could really give America a run for its money, right? China, okay, it has a lot of money, but doesn't have any resources. Russia doesn't have that much money, but has a lot of resources. China is strong in engineering. Russia is strong in basic sciences. You can imagine if the two were to really join forces, this could be a big problem for America. Moreover, a year and a half ago, we discovered that both China and Russia were leading the U.S. in the development of hypersonic missiles. right? It is thought that, the Chinese and the Russians were probably at least 2 years ahead of basically the Americans when it comes to hypersonic missiles. Not only the U.S. are behind, but that, they don't even have the natural defense against hypersonic missiles, which basically cannot be detected even by radar. Now, I think this is when the Americans decided, well, we got to do something. Now, personally, I'm very much of the view, you have to ask yourself the question, right? We can sit here, these days you open a newspaper, all these people who are speculating as to why basically Putin has decided to invade Ukraine, right? They say, oh, wow, he's interested. He wants to rebuild the Soviet empire, or that this guy is crazy, or that he's about to die. Whatever reason they come up with. You know what? There's a very simple concept in philosophy called Occam's razor. Occam's razor is an idea that, the explanation that,
the simplest explanation
is the
best one.
That requires the least amount of assumptions.
To me, the simplest explanation, he wanted to expand his country and back to the original borders.
Why should that be the simplest? Because you know what? I'll give you an example, right? Today, okay, take Ukraine as an example. Ukraine's got a population of 44 million people. To occupy a country of that size, 44 million, I can tell you, it requires between 1 to 50 in terms of the ratio of the occupying army versus occupying population. That means you need 1 million Russian soldiers on the ground to occupy a country of that size. Right now, the entire Russian army is only 800,000 people.
Without reserves.
Without reserves.
Reserves also, like 2 million more.
Yeah, exactly. But we're talking about active duty soldiers, right? Now, on top of that, what people need to realize is this. The Russian economy today is the size of that of Italy's. Okay?
Yeah, Florida.
Yeah. Their ability to sustain occupation to attack any country right now is zero. I mean, they know it. Again, that's what I'm saying. You think about this. Let's just assume there's a reason why 50% of the grandmasters in world chess today are Russian. Because the Russians are strategic thinkers. I mean, there is nobody who thinks more strategic than the Russians. And then, by the way, it's not a dictatorship. I mean, and the Russians are some of the most cynical people I know. So you got to basically think. So the Occam's razor for me in this kind of situation is basically, let's assume the guy's rational. Okay, just rational. By the way, one of the frameworks, analytical framework that I use a lot in my analysis over my 20-year career is game theory. The reason why, game theory is a study of strategic interaction among basically multiple players. You all saw The Beautiful Mind, basically the movie, Russell Crowe, and so on and so forth. John Nash, who was the father of game theory, and so on and so forth. The great thing about game theory is that every player is assumed to be rational, selfish, and calculating. That's it. They're all bastards in other words. Okay, there's no Mother Teresa or Adolf Hitler in basically game theory.
If we go to kind of your expertise, economics, right? One of the breakthroughs in economics was behavioral economics, which came and said people aren't rational, right? Like it's a mistake to think of us as these rational Homo economicus
on the borderline that, for example, there is like loss aversion, that kind of thing, and so on and so forth. But we're talking about something very different here because, again, you're about to commit your country in a war to invade another country, right? This is not a decision made by like one person. He's surrounded by lots of people. For time being, let's not assume he's crazy, that he's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire, because we don't know. You don't know, I don't know. But at least we should assume that most people, 90% of the people in the world, are fairly rational. So what would a rational person do it? Why should a rational person like Putin invade Ukraine? Well, it's very simple. Sometimes life's experience, I'm probably a bit older than you. Life has taught me sometimes people actually mean what they say. Putin has been telling us for a whole year. By the way, this basically troop deployment on the Ukrainian border has been going on since last March. So it didn't start like last month and they invaded spontaneously. It was not some kind of spontaneous invasion. It was in the planning. It was in the planning for a whole goddamn year. Now, all that entire time, Putin kept saying one thing. It was like he wanted neutrality for Ukraine. That's it. He just wanted. Now, you say, well, is that a lot to ask? Well, in case you don't know, Sweden, Finland, and basically Austria, 3 countries that are members of the European Union are not NATO members. Number two.
By choice.
By choice. Number two, in 1991, when Ukraine first became independent, its constitution says, basically, neutrality. It was not until basically 3 years ago that they passed the constitution amendment to basically now actively seeking NATO membership. My point is this. It's actually very funny if you think about this for a moment, right? Because now Zelensky says he's agreeable to neutrality, right? Even you read in his newspapers. But can that possibly be true? Because I would argue that in itself is fake news. You know why? Because if Zelensky, let's say tomorrow, decides, okay, fine, you know what? Let's do a deal with Russia. We'll do constitutional neutrality, which is now being discussed. I would say at that point onward, Zelensky is a dead man walking. Because think about this. I mean, he could have agreed to that 6 weeks ago and prevented the war. Instead, half the country is completely destroyed. 10 million people is displaced. Thousands of people are dead. How the hell could he justify to himself or to his people that all these people dying just so that he could make a decision, the same decision 6 weeks later?
But you don't think the Russians pushed them towards NATO by invading Crimea? I mean, didn't the efforts to join NATO really spark up after the invasion of Crimea?
But from the Russian perspective, they would tell you that the so-called 2014 Maidan Revolution that overthrew a democratically elected president was actually sponsored by the U.S. It was that prompted them to basically to invade Ukraine and basically annex Crimea.
Yeah, but that's not their business.
It's basically like their story against their story kind of thing.
Whatever the story is.
My word against your word
at this
kind of
point,
thing. No?
We don't really care because, you know what? I don't really care, who is right, who's wrong. Because at the end of the day, you know what? We can sit here all day talk about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We will never be able to reach a conclusion about who's right, who's wrong. All I'm interested in, what your listeners should be interested in, is what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Right? What is going to happen next is very simple. I just told you. Zelensky could not possibly be persuaded to do a deal with Russia right now, right?
So he's all in.
He's all in because in some sense, right, as I said before, if he were to give in now, after his country's been completely destroyed, he would agree, give in now and agree to the terms that, of constitutional neutrality, he's going to go in the history book as probably the worst and the most incompetent, clueless leader ever.
Unless they get him to his knees, which they couldn't do up until now.
To do what? To
get him on his knees.
To get who on his knees?
If the Russians...
They back him into a corner.
Oh, of course. I'm just saying I'm just saying voluntarily.
Yes.
Voluntarily. Okay.
Yes.
Now.
Because they're doing pretty good fighting back,
right.
He can afford not to back off.
Sure. So now think about this. Now you say, well, Zelensky cannot be a total idiot, right? I mean, the guy's Jewish after all. There can be such a dumb Jewish guy, right? I mean, even though he's only half Jewish. I think, there's no doubt. Like Zelensky, the guy, his biggest backer is Washington. I don't care listen, we can sit here all day and speculate. There is no way, Zelensky would have dared the Russians without backings from the Americans who told him
from NATO.
We'll have his back.
Yeah.
Now, I'll tell you something else. Now, you said, well, can the Americans at this point? Will the Americans tell Zelensky, you know what? Too many people are dying. It's not worth it. Oil price, all that is terrible. Why don't you just basically, finally, agree to Putin's terms? Do you think that's possible? No way, Jose. And the reason is very simple. Because if Zelensky were to sign a deal with Putin tomorrow, on these terms, this would not just be a Russian victory over Ukraine. It will be a Russian victory over the U.S. Because Zelensky is fighting with American money, fighting with American arms, fighting with American training. This will be a complete blow to a credibility of American foreign policy.
But where's China here?
Well, I'm going to come back to this. In fact, the United States cannot, fold the car right now. Because what message will be sending the Chinese? It's like, well, America is going to support Taiwan, but when push comes to shove, well, we're going to do nothing. What I'm saying is, there's a Chinese saying that says once you basically mount the back of a tiger, you cannot get off. Mm-hmm. So I'm telling you, Zelensky cannot get off now because now it's like, he's all in, right? Because otherwise, he's dead. for the Americans, they have to be all in now, because if they don't, given what's happened, they're going to lose all their credibility. You don't even think about this. Meanwhile, just think about all the other countries. India. Do you know last week, it was actually very interesting, okay? Last week, Boris Johnson had organized a delegation of senior, British MPs to visit New Delhi, to emphasize, to basically put pressure on New Delhi, to basically take a tougher stance on Russia. Guess what? The last minute, Prime Minister Modi canceled their trip. Instead, the Chinese foreign minister made an unexpected visit in New Delhi for the first time in 2 years. You know what? Do you know that the president of South Africa declared in front of his own parliament that, you know what? He said that it was the mistake of NATO that brought on this war. Okay. I don't have to tell you, Bin Salman, in Saudi Arabia, wouldn't even take a phone call from Joe Biden. And in fact, OPEC, by not agreeing to increase oil production, is allowing Putin to weaponize this. And I think for one reason, again, people are rational and they're calculating. All these countries, Brazil, India, these countries, by the way, together, they are bigger in real purchasing power than US, Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan combined. These are big countries we're talking about.
Yeah, Brazil, India. Yeah.
Okay, the BRIC countries.
Indonesia.
No, because all these countries, they realize, I just told you before, if the Americans succeed, to defeat Russia, in other words, remove Putin from power by resorting to economic, basically, war, if the U.S. succeeds, they could be next. They will be next. And this is why nobody's giving in. Because again, what you have to understand is that what the U.S. has done to Russia is something that they never even did to North Korea or to Iran in terms of economic sanctions. The sanctions they impose on Russia are something that are designed to set back the Russian economy for the next 20 years. And I think the Americans did this partly to weaken any partnership between Russia and China. They want to send a strong message to China that you don't want to go down this path with Russia, because this is why 2 weeks ago, if you remember, Biden did a summit phone call, Zoom, with Xi Jinping. And he told him those words, that, any material support that China gives to Russia, there will be serious consequences. Mm-hmm. So what I'm telling you right now is so the Americans cannot back down, because their whole foreign policy under the Biden administration is completely on the line. Zelensky cannot back down. Putin doesn't have to back down, because guess what? The latest opinion poll shows that he now enjoys 78% approval rating by an independent, survey company that he has accused in the past as being an asset of basically Western intelligence, right?
Yeah, but when you call a Russian guy and you ask him questions, he obviously...
I tell you, I've been working, I recently launched my own survey, basically in partnership with Rewe, which is a Canadian company that is basically the leader in online survey technology. Their clients, include like the UN, World Bank, and many, many intelligence agencies in the world. Let me tell you this. And because one of the reasons why they're so popular among these people is because they develop technology that allows people to answer questions anonymously. This is why we think more truthful.
Yeah, but if I'm an average Russian citizen and I get an email about answering a survey.
No. It's not an email. It's not an email. It's literally online. It's a random. You basically type in. Let's just say you want to go to the New York Times website and you misspell the thing. You might end up going to another website, and that's where you're presented the questions. Okay, but forget about all that. What I'm telling you is this. Okay, what people don't know about the Russians is this. If you look at the history of the Russian people, and there are a lot of Russians here in Israel, and you can go find out for themselves. Russia, I've worked all over the world. By the way, I was working at the International Monetary Fund in 1998, the year that Russia defaulted, devalued, and imposed capital controls. That was a hard time for Russia. But if you look back at the last 1,000 years, there isn't another nation that suffer as much as the Russians. And because only until, 200 years ago,
Except for the Jews.
the Jews were not a nation yet. But moreover, I don't know another nation where as patriotic as the Russians. Patriotism and the ability to suffer. You understand, only until 200 years ago, not even less than that, 90%, 80% of Russian people were serfs. In other words, they were slaves.
Yeah.
So you have to understand that the Russian people have been suffering, whether it was under serfdom, and then basically it was the Soviet communists, basically Gulag, whatever. These people have suffered a lot. And then before that, the Mongols. Okay, they were very, very cruel towards the Russians. But let me tell you one thing about the Russians. The Russians are mediocre people, culturally, until they're invaded. Napoleon decided to invade Russia, and Russia just basically mobilized, and then that was the downfall of Bonaparte. Hitler decided to invade Russia, and guess what? The Soviet Union mobilized and defeated Hitler in the Eastern Front. By the way, you got to think about this. The Second World War, at the end of the day, the Brits play a very marginal role. I mean, Churchill was a great man in terms of the thoughtfulness that was basically guiding the whole thing. But in terms of it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union that defeated Germany. And remember, it was after the Soviet Union had defeated Hitler in the Eastern Front before the Americans really started to basically roll up basically in Europe. My point here is this. The Russian people, it's pretty amazing. The Russian people are highly divided people. They're very cynical people. They're very pessimistic people. But when they feel threatened, that's when the whole country rallied together, and that's when Russia becomes a different beast. And I guarantee you, one thing I'm willing to bet anything on is that Russia is like, we've just woken up this dragon. Now, just think about this. The reason why the Russians went nowhere in the last 10 years is that, first of all, their brightest minds all came to Israel. A lot of them came to Israel. Secondly, is that all these basically oligarchs, right? Every penny they made, they're trying to get it out of the country as soon as possible. Guess what? There's no place they can basically park their money safely anymore, right? Their money is being literally confiscated here, confiscated.
Except Israel, some might say.
Israel is now under pressure also there to basically, believe me, what's going to happen now. The Russians now realize they only have Russia, Mother Russia, and let's make the best of it. And let's, as Putin said, fuck them all. Because I think this is actually...
He said it?
He said it. But listen, the point here is this. I'm just telling you, Zelensky cannot back down. The Americans cannot back down. Putin will not back down, and he doesn't have to back down. And all the other countries like China, Brazil, India...
need to take a side, basically.
But there's another way...
Yeah.
There's another way to, tell the story, right? There's another way to look at it, which is that Russia is this place with abysmal human rights, right? That he's maybe not a dictator. I mean, he is, for all intents and purposes, a dictator, right? I don't think anybody questions the actual legitimacy of elections or everybody questions the actual legitimacy of elections in Russia. And that he's this kind of thug that, yes, he legitimately considered NATO an encroaching threat, and he legitimately saw it as, okay, I need to defend myself. But in the end, he took proactive action and preemptive action against Ukraine, invaded Crimea, invaded Ukraine in the end, and is now causing, immense amount of devastation in Ukraine. So, isn't there kind of the other side to it, which is that Russia is this? Yeah, I'm not saying that necessarily the U.S. has no part in bringing this on themselves, but that Russia is obviously taking a stance here that's super problematic geopolitically, and that
they're the
US,
aggressor.
Yeah, that they're the aggressor.
I think it really depends how you look at this.
Yeah.
I'm actually, again, from a point of view of, if we just imagine we're playing this chess game, right? Again, that's why I don't want us to start to label people as thugs or saints, whatever it is, because I assume that Biden Zelensky, Putin, Xi Jinping, they're all calculating selfish bastards. So from that point of view, let's think about it in those terms as opposed to trying to basically, give them other names. But the way I look at this is this, right? And I'm not the only person who's saying this. Okay. It was very interesting. I told you, at the end of the Cold War came in 1991. At the time, that was basically, that was when, guess what? A lot of Eastern European countries, like Poland, for example, wanted to join NATO. And Bill Clinton said, sure, let's make this happen. Now, already back then in the 1990s, George Kennan is not a name that, you guys may know, but George Kennan was then, is the architect of America's Cold War containment strategy that succeeded in the end to bring down the Soviet Union, right? So there is nobody who know more about the Russians than George Kennan. He and 50 other leading Russian experts at the time basically signed a statement saying that the expansion of NATO was not only a huge mistake, but that George Kennan's own words, it was a mistake that was going to cause the founding fathers to basically twist in their graves. Okay? Because think about this, right? NATO was created, okay, to guess what? To fight communism. Right? Communism. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, right, when, there was no more communism. So the question is, at that point, why did you even need basically like NATO at all, right? And not only that, you started basically bring on members who were former members of, the Warsaw Pact, right? And then you're getting closer and closer to Russia. So the Russians are thinking like, what? By the way, Putin in 2000 actually offered to join NATO, and he was politely declined. Okay. The point here is this. I think the Russians
asked to join NATO when?
I think it was in 2000.
Wow.
Okay.
That's crazy.
And he was told basically no. The point here is this. That I think the Russians feel threatened. Mm-hmm. I think with good reason. And I'm not saying this is David Wu saying this. I'm telling you some of the most important experts, American experts on Soviet affairs, on foreign policy, thought it was a mistake. In fact, as late as, 2014, Kissinger came out and said that the most obvious solution to the Ukraine problem was constitutional neutrality for Ukraine. So even Kissinger basically understood that this was like an easy solution. Now, again,
so why do you think Ukraine pursued? You think it was really
the people,
a strategy?
Want...
No, it was a proxy by the United States.
Listen, this get into. Can we talk about? You want to hear some conspiracy theories?
Yes.
You want to hear some juicy? I don't know if you can air this, but no. I think you know what. Now it's out.
We can air everything.
Give us something that'll get us kicked off of Spotify.
Yeah. Okay.
We can air anything.
Yeah. Well, anyway, the last 2 weeks, you've all heard a lot about Hunter Biden's hard drive. Did you not? Yeah. You heard about that. It was in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So basically, it's all over now, right? Now, even the New York Times, I have to admit, I've been talking about this for the last 18 months, right? It's up until now. You know what? If you remember,
there's a Ukraine connection, right? To the
first of
Hunter
all,
Biden story.
What is the story here? The story here is that in 2014, right? 2014, after Russia went in, annexed basically Crimea, all of a sudden, Ukraine became an important crisis point during the Obama administration. So Obama made Joe Biden his point man on Ukraine. Okay. A couple of months later, don't quote me on the date, but 2 or 3 months later, maybe even 1 month later, Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, was appointed to the board of Burisma, which is the largest natural gas company in Ukraine. Basically, supposedly getting a monthly salary of $80,000. Okay, to put that in perspective, right? I mean, this is the man. So that we're talking about $700,000-$800,000 a year, right? I mean, that's a lot of money. But if you look it up yourself, again, only 2 years. What was Hunter Biden doing until then? Hunter Biden until 2012. Hunter Biden was an officer
Ukrainian
in the U.S.
hookers. Drugs and Ukrainian hookers.
Until 2012, Hunter Biden was an officer in the U.S. Navy. In 2012, he was expelled from the Navy, having tested positive for drugs. Okay. And his first big gig was getting this job at Burisma. Now, with no expertise in natural gas, no expertise on Ukraine, of course, but that goes without saying. Now, the point here is this. At the time, the Attorney General of Ukraine was conducting an investigation of Burisma. Okay, when Hunter Biden was appointed to the board. You know.
That's before the 2014 revolution.
No. It was 2014. Okay.
But before the revolution or after the revolution?
It
was after the revolution. Okay.
And then guess what? Shortly after, Hunter Biden was appointed to the board, okay, Joe Biden insisted that the Attorney General of Ukraine, who was conducting this investigation against Burisma, be fired. And he was fired. And by the way, you could look it up yourself. Now, of course, we don't know the connection. I mean, the fact that, Hunter Biden was working at Burisma and then the guy got fired may not have anything to do with his father. And until now, Joe Biden said, I had nothing to do with my son's business. Which is fine, whatever. So
yeah, it's a bit too close for comfort.
Until the hard drive was discovered, right? If you remember, in 2020, 3 months before the U.S. election, right, this hard drive basically came to light. I mean, the New York Post wrote the first article about this. The story was that, Hunter Biden, his laptop broke down, so he took it to a repair shop, and he forgot to pick it up. And then the guy basically from the repair shop kept calling. He never came. So the guy had to look at his hard drive to discover a lot of very interesting emails. And apparently the repair shop guy, made a copy and gave one to the FBI. And then he gave another copy, to Giuliani, because he never heard back from basically the FBI. And Giuliani gave it to the New York Post. And the New York Post did a forensic analysis of the hard drive. And one of the emails they unearthed, and that whole thing, was an email from a senior executive of Burisma to Hunter Biden saying, thank you for setting up that meeting, for meeting your father. It was a pleasure and honor. Now, I don't have to remind you. As soon as Washington Post published that article, as soon as New York Post published the article, Twitter shut down basically the account for New York Post.
Yeah.
All the mainstream media...
anyone couldn't share the article on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, on Twitter. In fact, if you recall, 50 former heads of intelligence agency, FBI, CIA, whatever security service, all wrote a joint letter saying this was a Russian plot to destabilize American, basically, election once again. So that whole story was shut out until 2 weeks ago. The New York Times finally
followed up.
Follow up, but obviously this thing is about to go public, and the New York Times doesn't want to look bad. So they want to get in front of the story, and that's what happened. Mm-hmm. We now know there's an FBI investigation ongoing, and it's also because back then, even though the FBI had already had the hard drive in its possession for a few months, according to the repair guy, the FBI never even acknowledged that they had this hard drive in their possession even back then.
So what does all that mean to the world economy?
What it means is this: we have no idea why the Ukrainians did not do the reasonable thing. Why did the Ukrainians were banking on huge support from the U.S., from the Biden administration? Why all of a sudden Zelensky and Biden, let me tell you this, ever since Biden got elected, Zelensky was trying to get himself invited to the White House. He finally got himself invited last September, in his press conference, the first thing he said was that I'm here to basically elicit the support of the President of the United States for NATO membership of Ukraine. The bottom line here is, who knows what is at the personal level, the country level.
What's happening is a given, right? But it might affect the economy, because I want to get us a bit to the economy. Although we could go on and on with that.
No, but I think it's
all intertwined.
It's inseparable.
Of course. But I'm trying to understand, assuming that what you say is true, and what it means is that we are going to face months and months and maybe years of war up ahead.
I think
And what does that mean
Sure.
on
Sure. Is that a fair assessment?
What you need to understand, first of all, this is a proxy war. What's going on in Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and China, two global superpowers, and I think what you need to realize, first of all, for your audience, is this. Okay. Under Trump, okay, Trump didn't want Trump also recognized that China represent a major threat to the U.S. And he did not want the Russians and Chinese to get together. So what did he do? He engaged in a divide and rule policy towards both China and Russia. Every time he saw Xi Jinping, he would say, "Oh, wow, Xi Jinping is a great man. The greatest man in China, and he's my best friend." Every time he saw Putin, Putin's my best friend, and he is a great man. You know what? This is the reason why under Trump, you know what?
Nothing happened.
Nothing ever happened. Okay? Now, however, under Biden, everything...
Maybe he's not so stupid as people say.
Under Biden, everything. So basically, now...
Also under Obama.
Obama as well. Obama and Biden's the same. But the point here is, what I'm saying is that right now, it's like, well, I don't tell you, Trump and bin Salman, if it hadn't been for Trump's relationship with bin Salman, there wouldn't have been the peace that we saw between Israel, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and so on and so forth. I mean, that was an incredible thing. I mean, you think about this, right? Because it's ultimately about the personality, the president of the United States, that was in the business of making deals, right? Right now, the Americans are not even on speaking terms with the Russians. I mean, there is no deal making even happening. All they're doing is writing more checks to the Ukrainians, sending more arms to Ukrainians, so to basically fight to death, right? It's a war to the last man except the last Ukrainian man.
It's amazing how quickly it turned around. It went downhill, right? I mean, just, 4 years ago, even less, Trump was meeting with Putin, shaking hands.
Exactly. Because you know what?
That's a regime change in America. You change the president, you change everything. 180%.
Yeah, but talk about screwing the pooch. I mean, Biden showed up and within no time, it's just devolved into an all-out war.
World chaos.
You know what it is? And this is obviously, just like right now people say, oh, wow, Putin's crazy. Back then, it was like they said Trump was crazy, right? Because people who make deals are crazy. No, but I think, the important thing to understand about this is that when Trump said that he wanted to make America great, you know what he really meant? He wanted to make America great for the little guys. Trump was not interested in the glory of America, enjoying global domination, that kind of thing, right? Trump was not a globalist. Trump was only interested in the little guys. Now think about who's suffering. Who are most suffering from basically this war in Ukraine? Mm-hmm. The little guys, right? The little guys who are basically paying, if you think about inflation being 8%, right? I mean, so much of it is energy, food, and so on and so forth. Poor people, they spend disproportionately more money on energy and food than rich people.
Yeah.
So there is no doubt the biggest loser are the little guys, and not just the little guys in America, the little guys worldwide. Just think about the people in Africa, the children who are going to go to bed hungry tonight because wheat prices have gone up 25% as a result of this war. So if you think about what this really means. So again, Trump was not interested in glory for America, okay? Which is a very different thing than the people around Biden. People around Biden, like Blinken and others, they're called, you can look it up. Again, you can Google this before the election, just shortly after the election, people were talking about the neocons are going to get senior appointments in this administration, which they all did, by the way. And what did the neocons believe? And by the way, you tend to associate neocons with with the Iraq war, with Republicans, but that's not true anymore, okay? There are many Democrats who are basically in the neocon mode. The neocon believes in three things. They believe, first of all, a unipolar world in which the U.S. is the top. Two, they believe, and the reason is because they believe in the supremacy of liberal democracy. They think it's the best system in the world, okay? And thirdly, they believe in interventionist foreign policy, okay? Trump didn't believe any of this. He didn't believe that, America, there could only be like one power at the top, that's the US. He didn't care about liberal democracy per se, right? I mean, he certainly did not care about whether other countries adopt liberal democracy, by the way. Okay? I mean, this is why I've always said, Trump always said when he was the whole Hong Kong protest, he said, I was not elected the president of Hong Kong. I was basically elected as president of the United States. I'm not going to basically compromise, basically the interests of American people in order to basically save the Hong Kong people. What for? Anyway, that's not his mandate. And thirdly, Trump does not believe in interventionist foreign policy. That's why he wanted to pull back from this place and that place and so on and so forth. So my point here is it's a very different vision. This is what you need to understand. It's two very different visions, okay, about America's place in the world and what it means for the little guys, which has to do with economics. Because there is no doubt that this war is a very expensive war for the little guys. Economically, it's only bad. It's really, really bad. Because what people don't mean, this is why, just people don't get it. You say, Russia is such a small, it's just size of Italy, so who cares? Russia sanctioned, right? I mean, unfortunately, as you probably know by now, Russia is the largest oil exporter in the world. They are the biggest exporter of nickel, aluminium. They're basically the biggest exporter of neon gas, without which you can basically make semiconductors and so on and so forth.
From Italy, from visiting and talking to Italians, that, lots of their tourist places are, the main clientele is Russians. So they are preparing to a devastating season without any clients. So this can demolish economies.
Exactly.
Italian economy, for example, which is already demolished. And who knows the ripple effect of that.
I'm glad you basically brought this up, because the only people... So you look at this game, right? You say all these people around the table, they have reasons for this thing to continue, right? Except for one people, the Europeans. Because the Europeans definitely are getting the short end of the stick, right? I mean, the European economy now is literally teetering on the edge of another recession, right? Because they're so dependent on gas and oil. They're dependent on Russian tourism in some places. Germany, Russia is one of the largest trading partners for Germany. This is going to be a complete disaster for Europe. The question, however, you have to ask yourself is that why didn't the Europeans stand up to the Americans and say, you know what? We're going to take this one. We're going to try to mediate a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. That's the question that the Germans and the French, they could have said to the Americans, you know what? Leave this alone. This is a European story. We're going to work this one out. They didn't. Partly because I think, you had a new government in Germany. Had Angela Merkel still be chancellor in Germany, I think things probably would have been worked out, because she has a lot of credibility with the Americans, with the Russians, so on and so forth. If Macron had been a different person, the problem is that the guy is a jerk, okay? And he's immature, okay? Things might have worked out differently. I think, it's unfortunate, but you're exactly right. Europe, right now, they realize. It's actually, it's very interesting. So you remember, 2 weeks ago, Biden was in Poland. That was when he made the speech about regime change, right? And then they say, afterwards, he didn't mean what he said.
After the Poles wanted him to come for some time, if I'm not mistaken, he wouldn't come to Poland.
Yes.
He would boycott Poland for some time, right?
Exactly.
Because of the regime there, it's too right-wing for him, and until finally he had to come because...
Yeah, exactly.
Who knows why.
And they started talking about regime change. It was very interesting. The reaction from the European capitals the next day, it was shocking, because the European leaders were in total shock, because they never heard such language, not from Biden, not from Trump, not from any American president since basically the end of the Second World War. They all of a sudden woke up to the realization that they did not sign up for this, right? They didn't think that they were going after Putin to basically bring about regime change. And they understand what that means, because Putin is going to hit the nuclear button before he allows himself to be taken out. And let me tell you this, it was funny, almost. The British which until now has been the most vociferous, the most vocally critical of Russia, Putin, sanctions, that kind of thing. The next day, okay, after Biden's speech, the British foreign minister came out and said that if Putin were to withdraw his trip, we'll get rid of all the sanctions right away. You know what? This is why the Europeans are waking up to this reality, but I'm sorry, it's a little bit too late.
But Biden walked back those words, right? Because I think he doesn't really keep track of what he's saying or what he's claiming anymore these days. But I'm wondering if I mean, we're talking about how quickly things took a turn for the worse once Biden came into office. I mean, if in 2 years' time he's gone, could things turn around just as quickly, or is it harder?
It's 3 years.
It's 3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
Yes.
And I think, 3 years is a very long time.
Will there be a globe in 3 years? Will there be?
I think, listen, I think this is where the economics comes in. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is actually where it gets interesting. Because you say, well, what has to change for somebody around the table to change course? That's what I do for a living, right? You're making forecasts. You realize that people have a certain reaction function. They have a certain incentive function. And then they're going to keep doing what they're doing because it's in their best interest until it no longer makes any sense. Now you say, well, what would it... And I'm telling you, the Russians are capable of great suffering. So misery is not going to stop the Russians. Zelensky, half of the country is already destroyed. If he's going to, another basically 30% of countries destroy, I don't think it's going to be, it's not going to change him. The Chinese, none of them. No. The only thing that can change the Americans, in my view, because America only understands the power of money. If the U.S. stock market drops 25% and the U.S. economy goes into recession, I think then the U.S. will change course. Because, to understand this logic, you have to understand, until now, it's like, well, America says, you know what? We're not Europe, right? Europe is dependent on Russian energy. But we're not dependent on Russian energy. Europe is close to Russia. We're like really, really far away. And anyway, we're not planning to sending any soldiers, okay, on the ground anyway. And then basically there are no Russian tourists in the U.S. is nothing, right? U.S. trade with Russia is almost nothing. So from a U.S. standpoint, economically, they thought it was not going to be a big deal, right? And the U.S. economy was growing strongly and so on and so forth. But I think the Americans are making a mistake. I think actually, in the end, you'll see, and this is my prognosis for the U.S. economy in the next basically couple of months, is not good. And I'll tell you why. Because we said already, even before Russia invaded Ukraine, inflation was already run away, right? The Federal Reserve was already basically getting ready to start to basically tighten monetary policy by raising interest rates. Just think about this. You're now getting more inflation, okay? Coming basically, you're importing oil. Because at the end of the day, oil, at the end of the day, American consumers are paying more or less the same international price for oil as consumers anywhere else in the world, right? That's the bottom line, because oil, it doesn't really matter who produces what. The consumers pay the same international price, which is what we're $110 a barrel right now in the world. America's a little bit less than that, but not much more. But the point here is this is going to put a lot of pressure on the Fed to keep raising interest rates. And that ultimately is going to tip the U.S. into a recession. I mean, already it's actually very interesting.
Mortgages and loans are going to skyrocket the prices.
Mortgage rates last week hit 5%, which is the highest level in 3 years. Mm-hmm. Okay, consumer confidence, last week came out, it hit basically the lowest level in 10 years.
So basically people will go bankrupt.
Listen, all this is going to take a bit of time. Yeah. Okay, and then the stock market is in a bubble and so on and so forth. And this caused the stock market to basically bubble, to burst, and that kind of thing. That's what normally happens. I mean, 9 out of 10 times. I mean, if you could look back at the last 8 recessions, 6 of them were brought on by basically a spike in oil price. Okay, while interest rates are going up. So this won't be the first time, nor be the last time, and I can guarantee you that. By the way, one of the few recessions that was not brought on by a spike in energy price, of course, was the recession in 2000 when COVID came along. Okay, that obviously had nothing to do with, but that kind of recession doesn't happen that often. But oil usually plays a very big part.
Is there something the U.S. there was talk in the U.S. about the Keystone XL and maybe that solving or alleviating part of the oil?
But that's the problem,
prices?
right? Because the Democrats, right, they came in with very green policy, right? They stopped basically the Keystone pipeline. In fact, ever since the Democrats came in, right, oil production in the U.S. has actually has been recovering very slowly. I mean, we haven't even gone back to where there was before the pandemic. Because I can tell you this, you might have heard of this called ESG investing thing, whatever. Basically, the bottom line here is, right now, in the last year, since the Democrats took over, banks have become much more reluctant to give out loans to companies to engage in oil drilling. Right? Because banks are worried that what happens if all these progressive people start to basically demonstrate. Now, forget about regulation. This is about reputation effect. Imagine all of a sudden these environmentalists, progressives start to basically line outside your bank headquarters every day saying that you're killing the planet. And then all these companies, investors, they don't want to invest in energy companies. Because they might be accused of trying to abet these basically oil guys to ruin the planet. So as a result, the whole oil industry has been bunkering down, right? So you want to cut your dependence on fossil fuel. At the same time, you want to basically stop the Russians, You want to stop the world from importing Russian oil. So what are you going to do? There is no it's like this, right?
Windmills.
Well, that's it. Windmill is, the problem with windmill, what people don't realize is that
you can get stuck on the windmill and die.
Do you know for every wind turbine, it requires something like 500,000 tons, 500,000 basically tons of, a ton of basically copper. To make the wind turbine, by the way, it's actually very interesting. If you were the biggest wind turbine manufacturer in the world is a Norwegian company. The stock went through the roof last year. Right now, the stock is down sharply. Nobody can make money anymore. Because what happens is to make wind turbines, you need all these raw materials, price of which have gone up 50%, 100%, 150%, whatever. It's impossible. Because, again, this is even with
good news
wind.
For the birds.
Exactly. Thank God for the birds. You're talking about just 5% of the world's energy being met by wind. Already, this is driving up commodity prices to levels that no longer commercial. So, can you basically really substitute fossil fuel? And this is actually a very interesting thing, because right now it's the Americans are telling the Germans, we want you to impose sanctions. I want you to stop basically buying energy from Russia, because right now at this point, right, they want Putin to go. By the way, it's not just basically, last week was actually very interesting. You might have heard of this historian by the name of Niall Ferguson. He was former Harvard professor. He's now basically, at the Hoover Institute. And he wrote an article last week that came out on Bloomberg in which he quoted, this is a guy, he's a bit of a neocon himself. This is why he gets invited to a lot of very, fashionable, private events in Washington. And he reported, supposedly, he actually wrote this out as a quote, that a senior Biden administration official was said, at a private event, that the only game in town now is regime change in Russia. And this was 2 days before Biden mentioned the word regime change, by the way. This is not, I don't think at this point you need to be a conspiracy theorist to think that the Americans are really thinking about this. For the reason I just gave you before, they cannot afford to.
Of course, it's their wet dream for a regime. Okay, we have 2 minutes. Okay, I have a killer question.
A brilliant question.
Let's see whose question is better.
Go.
Mine is, in 2 minutes, will China invade Taiwan?
I don't think so. I think, listen, put it this way. China would invade Taiwan only if Taiwan were to hold a referendum and decide to become an independent country. That's it. Okay. And Taiwan will never hold a referendum, okay, on referendum for independence, unless the Americans said, go ahead. This is actually a perfect example. Okay, this is, again, the Taiwanese won't have the guts to hold a referendum without the Americans saying, you know what, we'll basically have your back, and basically there will be no consequence for you to do this. And this is very important. This is why what happened in Ukraine is so important. That's why the government in Taiwan right now is looking at Zelensky. Interestingly, right? You know, imagine Zelensky right now is an international superstar. He even addressed the Emmy yesterday. But this guy, half his country is already destroyed. His people are on a run, that kind of thing. I mean, the Taiwanese president was asking, look, would you really want to see half of Taiwan completely destroyed so that you can basically speak to at the Emmys or whatever it is, you know?
He actually spoke at the Emmys, by the way, yes. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
What was yours?
Well, Andrew Cuomo won an Emmy, so after that, I mean, I guess anybody. I want to say, I want to ask, as the little guy, take us back to the economics. As a little guy, what can I do to better prepare for what's ahead?
Really have 2 minutes.
Yeah. I think for the little guy, honestly, now I think it depends where is the little guy? Is the little guy in Israel or is the little guy somewhere else? Right?
Let's say I'm the little guy in the U.S.
I would say, first of all, I'm interested in Israel because this is, I think Israel is in an excellent position. I think most Israelis don't realize how good they have it. And one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about Israel is that Israel is not allowing itself to be dragged into one camp or the other. Okay. This is a situation where, and I think Bibi was very good at it, which is to navigate between the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese. Because I think what the big lesson right now, if you're Ukrainian, it's like you can't trust the Americans. When push comes to shove, nobody's going to come save you. You're completely on your own. It doesn't really matter. They give you money, whatever. Your people are going to die. And because at the end of the day, global politics, this is a proxy war between China and the U.S. The U.S. decided to go after China, even if it means that Ukraine is going to be completely destroyed. That is of secondary interest. And I think Israel needs to continue to basically, I think it is really generally a cynical, especially on the right. On the left, I think Israelis have a tendency to trust the Americans too much. And I think this is a situation where I think the big lesson here is this. Also, I'll tell you something else. The single most important, you say, well, what is this Cold War about between China and the U.S. and Russia? At the end of the day, they're not going to go to war with each other because they're both nuclear nations. They can destroy the world a few times over with the stock of nuclear weapons. This is not going to be about the economy, so to speak, because both are very, very large economies. It's going to come down to one thing. This Cold War is about the war over technology. This is the only thing. Both sides understands perfectly that technology is going to win this Cold War, whoever's going to win. Israel, has what everybody else wants, which is this culture of innovation, technology. That's how Israel should position itself. And also, let me tell you this, the coming recession, there will be a recession coming because we're now, if I'm right, that this war is going to, that basically what's happening in Ukraine is a dress rehearsal for the coming Cold War between US and China, or the US bloc versus the China bloc. The world is we're going to go into recession very soon. In a recession environment, I can guarantee you, anti-Semitism is going to get really, really bad, as we've seen in the last couple of years already.
Israel wins again.
And then all the Jews in the world, they're going to come to Israel. And for all the right reason, by the way. So from that point of view, I personally think Israel's the place to be because I think Israel just needs to be smart. It needs to be smart, diplomatically.
Last words because we gotta. Okay. Okay. That was the.
Yeah. And I think this is why I think Bibi. I'm an American. My parents from China. Listen. Let's think about this, right? I was born in Pittsburgh. Okay. I was born in Pittsburgh. I grew up in Taiwan. My parents came from China. I was educated in the U.S. I spent half of my working career in Europe, and now I live in Israel full time.
Wow.
I've met a lot of prime minister presidents. my team at Bank of America, that basically, my team of 50 analysts at Bank of America, we were forecasting 150 countries. We were ranked number 1 in the world. Basically, the year I left, I've analyzed a lot of people. Netanyahu is probably the best, basically, prime minister I've seen in the last 10 years anywhere in the world. And I think this is why Israel is in a very unique position today.
You met him, you mean?
I've never met him.
Okay.
I'm just looking at the policy that's happened under him that makes Israel what it is today. And I just hope the people who are now running the government don't screw that up.
Amen. Amen.
Amen to that.
Word. Wow, David Wu, thank you so much for
fascinating.
Really
I feel like we got to do a follow-up in a few months.
Yeah.
Are you up for it?
To see if I'm completely wrong. Yes, absolutely. If I'm wrong, we can definitely do a follow-up.
Cool. We'll check in every couple of months.
And if you're right, also we'll do a follow-up.
Okay.
It'll be as interesting. Thank you so much. Okay, let's plug your channel. You have a YouTube channel. How can people find it?
Yeah, so it's David Wu Unbound.
Okay.
UNBOUND. And, I put out a video every Sunday, around, 7 p.m. Israel time. And the idea is that I focus on the theme of the week, usually is a major macro theme. I talk about what I think by just simply looking at numbers and facts. And at the end, I'll tell you how you can actually make money even.
Okay, I'm going to subscribe. Amazing. And you're on Twitter.
And I'm on Twitter as well.
Wu is, guys, it's W-O-O.
W-O-O.
If you're wondering. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. It was...
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm speechless.
Yeah, really incredible. Thank you, and we'll see you next time, guys.
Bye, guys.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.